In 1952, Dwight David Eisenhower, one of the American heroes of World War II, was elected President of the United States. Ike, as he was known, was an incredibly popular figure at the time. In fact, he was so popular that both political parties were hoping that Eisenhower would accept their nomination for president. Eisenhower had never even voted in a presidential election until 1952, and the Democrats were hoping that he would run as their candidate, but Eisenhower declared himself a Republican and agreed to accept the Republican nomination for president in 52. Eisenhower was a moderate conservative, so I think he was more at home in the Republican Party, but one reason that he apparently decided to run as a Republican was to prevent Senator Robert Taft of Ohio from getting the Republican nomination. And Eisenhower's main concern about a Taft presidency is that Taft was an isolationist. Eisenhower, largely because of his experience in World War II and also as the first commander of NATO forces, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the late 40s, believed that it would be a disaster for the world for the United States to retreat into an isolationist shell. So it was largely to prevent Taft from getting the Republican nomination that Eisenhower decided to run as a Republican. Anyway, he won the election, and I think today, after serving 8 years in office, Eisenhower is regarded as one of our better modern presidents. At the time, however, he was considered to be something of a disappointment, especially by conservatives who believed that now with the Republican president for the first time in 20 years and a Republican-controlled Congress, the New Deal could be scrapped, Social Security could be done away with, stuff like that, and that the United States would take a harder line with regard to the Cold War. When in fact, none of this happened, many conservatives were left bitterly disappointed in Eisenhower. But I think most people give Eisenhower high marks for steering the country through what in some ways was a very difficult period. One way that Eisenhower's management style is sometimes described is that he was said to operate with a hidden hand. In other words, Eisenhower appeared to say and do very little in public. It appeared to many people that Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was running foreign policy and Sherman Adams and others were running domestic policy, while Ike just sat back and played golf and basically let other people do all the heavy lifting. We now know that behind the scenes, Eisenhower was actually in control of almost everything, that he just preferred to operate in a fashion that made it appear that others were actually making most of the decisions. So it looked like John Foster Dulles was controlling foreign policy when in fact Eisenhower was pretty much in control. At any rate, another phrase that sometimes applied to the Eisenhower presidency is holding the line. Eisenhower does not, for the most part, expand the welfare state. He held the line against expansion of most of the New Deal programs that were still around, but he didn't get rid of them either. And in foreign policy, Eisenhower basically continued the containment policy of the Truman administration, in other words, holding the line against the expansion of communism. But unlike his Secretary of State, Dulles, who talked about liberation and rollback, not containment, Eisenhower basically continued the containment policy. Now, even if he wasn't in control as much as most people at the time thought, John Foster Dulles was a very powerful and influential Secretary of State. He adopted what was referred to as the New Look defense policy, which placed more of an emphasis on nuclear deterrent than on conventional forces. And he also went around giving a lot of speeches about how containment was too limited, and so the United States was going to abandon the containment doctrine in favor of a doctrine of liberation or rollback. In other words, we're not just going to be satisfied with containing the further expansion of communism, but we're going to seek to liberate countries that are already under communist control, or in other words, roll it back. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, I guess, except that when the voice of the administration on foreign policy, Secretary Dulles, said one thing, but the Eisenhower administration generally did another, it sometimes led countries into thinking that if we rise up against the communists, the United States will come to our aid. And there was an uprising in East Germany in 1953 and a major uprising in Hungary in 1956. And in neither case did the United States intervene on the side of the rebels. And the Soviets were able to crush both uprisings. Given the tense situation at the time, though, I think Eisenhower's holding the line strategy, basically continuing containment, was probably the right policy. However, Dulles did advocate, and to some extent the Eisenhower administration did adopt a greater reliance on nuclear weapons, which came to be referred to as massive retaliation. In other words, the idea now is that we will rely more on the nuclear deterrent, and if the communists make a move in anywhere in the world, we will retaliate with nuclear weapons. This was sometimes described as more bang for the buck, meaning that this was seen, among other things, as a cost-saving measure. Nuclear weapons were not cheap, but in many ways they were more cost-effective than maintaining a large conventional military. As with liberation and rollback, however, massive retaliation may have backfired to some extent on the United States because communists in places like Vietnam, for example, knew deep down that the United States was probably not going to retaliate with nuclear weapons. And so in some ways, the focus on massive retaliation as opposed to a more conventional approach might have actually encouraged communism in some cases. Overall, though, Eisenhower deserves credit, if for nothing else, for keeping the United States at peace during the entire 8 years he was in office, which is no small accomplishment for any president, but especially in the 50s when in some ways the Cold War was at its height. And if Eisenhower had wanted to get the United States heavily involved in military confrontations in the 50s, he almost certainly could have. Eisenhower just preferred to operate, again, behind the scenes, and one thing that meant was he did rely heavily on covert operations, using the CIA, for example, to subvert unfriendly governments in places like Iran and Guatemala. Now, some of that would later come back to bite the United States later, but as far as a major military commitment, Eisenhower managed to hold back from that. He did get the United States involved in Vietnam to some extent, though not with ground combat troops. That would come a decade later under Lyndon Johnson.